Good morning. I wanted to talk about the beans that I'm planting this year and get some suggestions from anybody out there who has beans that they like to grow and that might grow well as pole beans or as runner beans. I need my beans to grow up on trellises because I don't have a whole lot of space down low. And I like to companion plant with other things underneath my beans. So it's nice to just have them take up as little space as possible close to the ground and as much space vertically as I can trellis. So the beans that I have grown traditionally for the last few years have been 4 different types. So I'll tell you about each one individually, and then talk about why I plant them. And there's one that I may not plant again, even though I like the results. I'm not quite as happy with its climbing habit. So the first of these that I ever grew was the Scarlet runner bean, and at that time I was planting other random beans. I tried the Cherokee Trail of Tears beans, which I like the backstory. Well, I mean, the backstory is very sad, but it's a very interesting backstory. But the beans themselves, I just couldn't fall in love with. But at that time, I was also growing Scarlet runner beans, which I've had growing for many years, and it took me a long time to learn to love them. And I think part of the problem was that I wasn't planting them in the right places. I just didn't understand Scarlet runner beans well enough. Now that I do understand them, I'm really beginning to appreciate their value. So these are, these are what my Scarlet runner beans look like. They're a little darker than some that I've seen, and I don't know if, they have sort of the traditional mottled color. You probably can't see that very well, but they are more dark purple than they are speckled with that kind of reddish color. But the red, I think that the Scarlet runner beans really refers to, the scarlet is in the flowers, and they are just as scarlet flowers as you might imagine. And the beans are just fine as far as Scarlet runner beans go. What I was doing wrong with Scarlet runner beans for a while was I was planting them with too much sunlight. That was not working out because even in Rhode Island here, we get some very hot days and very sunny days during the summer, and the runner beans just don't want to pollinate on days that are too hot. So you really need to put them in a spot where they get sun, but not full on harsh sunlight all day long. They need a break. And so I have since learned to plant them in places where they're not quite as inundated with sunshine, and they do better. So that's sort of a lesson that I learned with them, and I've learned to appreciate them more now that I've gotten them to grow more successfully. The second bean I'm going to talk about is also a runner bean, and this is a white runner bean. I really like the flavor of these beans. It makes a great soup bean, and they're very large white beans, the size of lima beans, maybe even when they are hydrated, maybe even a little bit bigger than some limas. They have a nice texture, a nice smooth texture, great as a soup bean. So I appreciate them even more, I'd say, than I do with the Scarlet runners. The only downside to these white runner beans is that usually I don't get more than 1 or 2 out of every pod, so it's smaller pods. So I've thought perhaps of ordering some white runner beans that are in longer pods and see if I like them as much. Maybe put these aside for a year. This year is not the year for it, but I may do that in the future. So for right now though, happy with the white runners. I'd like to plant more of them this summer. Last year it was a bit of a mixed year with some squirrel issues in the spring and then a late start, and so they could have used a slightly longer season. But we had some cold spells later in the spring, and things just didn't get started quite as early as usual. So the next bean that I've discovered, and this is, the white runner bean came from a trade with somebody. All of these beans, except for the final one, came from trades with other people where they recommended them. I asked and they recommended them, and I took the recommendation, and I'm thrilled that I did. So this is rattlesnake beans that came from a recommendation from another friend. And you should be able to see this pretty well. They kind of look almost like pinto beans. They are a really nice green bean in the summer. And they grow prolifically. They're nearly stringless. Later in the season, I tend to find more stringy ones, but they are great right off of the vine. Once again, it's a vining. It's not a runner bean, it's a pole bean. And it will grow quite tall. I've had them grow 7 or 8 feet tall. So you really have to have the trellising to handle it. And they just keep producing. So this is a keeper. I will probably always grow these as my go-to stringless summer bean. So the final bean that I am going to plant probably this season, I just have to decide. I've been growing these for quite some time, and these are tiger's eye beans. And I have to admit, the reason that I started these in a year when I wanted some really cool looking beans, and I thought, well, this is advertised as a good dual use bean, as both a dry bean and a green bean, like a string bean. So I gave them a shot, and I have to say I love them as a dry bean, but it's really hard for me to produce enough dry beans in my space to make it worthwhile, number one. Number two, they're supposed to be a pole bean, but they really don't have a good, strong polling habit. They're kind of halfway between a bush bean and a pole bean, and it doesn't work as well for me. They just don't climb that high, and they don't produce as much as I would hope to for the square footage on the ground. So yes, this is a good amount of beans, but for the number of vines that I planted, it's not as much as I would have hoped. So I'll probably plant it again, but I need to find the right spot, and I haven't quite decided on that. I have been considering growing asparagus beans, and Chinese noodle beans, they're also called. But I'm having second thoughts right now, and I'd love your input on that. Now these are, you can see here, you're not going to save these as a dry bean. Now these are just saved for replanting. Here's the thing about the noodle beans. These will probably try to cross with these rattlesnake beans, and I prefer the rattlesnake beans. From what I understand, or at least I don't know if I prefer the rattlesnake beans, but from what I've read, the rattlesnake beans are actually a really good tasting bean compared to the noodle beans. Not that there's anything wrong with the noodle beans, but it's just preferred. And so they'll cross-pollinate. It could contaminate my seeds here, the rattlesnake bean seeds, with something that I might not want as much. So like I say, I'm having second thoughts about that. I love the idea of these really long beans, but when I think about it, I'm getting plenty of beans from my rattlesnake beans, so why mess with something that's working? So those are the 4 beans that I intend to plant this year. However, I am looking for a substitute for these beautiful tiger's eye beans. I would love to find a really good dual use bean, a bean that could be used both in the summertime as a green bean and then saved as a saved bean, like a pinto bean or something like that. Now these, like I say, the tiger's eye beans, they make a really great dry bean. It's a lot like a pinto bean when you go to use it. So I wouldn't mind having something that was better straight off the vine and something that had a better vining habit. If I could just find something that had a vining habit and was prolific and created a great dry bean, that would be good enough. I don't necessarily need the dual use because I have the rattlesnake beans, which are working really well for me already. So that's my request to you, is to please tell me, what do you have for dry beans that is really working well for you and is a pole bean, not a bush bean and not a sort of shrimpy little half pole bean like the tiger's eye variety that I have. I'd really like to find another variety, so please leave a comment for me down below. Give me a thumbs up if you would, really appreciate that, and please subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this video. I'd love to share more information with you, and I'd love to hear back from you about what's working for you. And if you want to interact more, please consider taking a look at the Food Forest Garden Club. It's foodforestgardenclub.org. I'm also on Instagram, which would be at Food Forest Garden Club. And we can be in touch directly, but there's also a lot of other people who are getting involved in this project there too. And I'd love you to meet them. I'd love to get in contact with you. So thank you so much for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.